Hi everyone, welcome back to RIT 1003. This is lecture 3, part 2. And what we will be discussing now is using sources and creating movements. Now, this is one of the most important aspects of academic writing. We use sources in many ways to give our readers an accurate accounting of what is already known about a problem or issue, to figure out the current conversation going on about a specific question in a particular discipline, and also to help us think and develop an idea of our own. Today, we are going to be looking at how to use sources, how to choose quotations, and how to create movements in our own thinking and idea with them. So to summarize, to find a source and use it in your work, and especially in the humanities where using quotations is frequent, you will need to know details about the content and form. That is, patterns that equate to evidence, and we've already looked at how to do that. You will also need to know how to name those patterns, because that leads you to the concepts that the author, the writer of the source you're using, will be looking at. It's also very helpful to do the same with your own work. Thirdly, you need to read the writer's work very carefully. You're looking for idea, and you will find it based on the work that you've done with evidence, patterns, and the relationship amongst those patterns. Finally, the last thing you need to know, and you need to practice, is what you think about that idea. That is thought reflection. We'll be looking at all of those in this particular part of the lecture. Using sources, and especially quotations, is one of the weakest points in many students' work. That's in part because we are all too prone to use other people's ideas and what they think just to underline the fact that we think we're right. We use them as repetition to show, hey, look, I'm right. I'm using this writer, and look, that writer agrees with me. They think just the way I do. So if the first number there is your own work, what you're doing with the source is you're equating what you think to what that other person thinks. You end up with 1 = 1 = 1 and a lot of repetition. The problem with doing this is, first of all, you've probably chosen the quote based on the agreement with your own thinking, so you're probably taking it out of the context of the author's full complex idea. In fact, you probably missed the author's idea in doing that. And you really are just repeating what you've already said. Here's a very different way to think about using sources. And when I talk about using sources, I am talking about a particular way of using sources in humanities writing. When you're writing essays and such, and you are asked to draw on another person's thinking, and you are asked to use that in your own work. So we have 1 + 1 = 2 and 2 + 1 = 3 and so on and so forth. So what's the difference between the slide I just showed you and this one? Here it is. You connect to an author's idea. You find something the two of you have in common, but then you use that writer's idea to add to or extend or to question your own thinking. In other words, you're creating movement by introducing, once again, a shared aspect, and then looking for what that author says that you haven't. That's how you create movement. And that is how you turn a paper from passable into possibly brilliant. So I wanted to visualize this for you. The photograph you're seeing is called Hooney in the Real World. The original sculpture is by Tom Otterness. It's in Battery City Park in New York City. And if you look very closely at my little recording box, you will see the original of the photograph behind me. So why am I presenting you with this photograph? Well, if you think about it, if the original sculpture by Tom Otterness, the bronze dog, is another writer's work, and the very live bulldog on the right of the image is you, what that means is you take the author's original work, and like the real bulldog, you examine the original work very, very carefully. And then when you incorporate it in your own work, you actually become the photographer who created this new image. You are giving us a new look or a new perception through the use of that original author's work. So, enjoy. At this point, I'm going to summarize the steps to using a source to create movement in your work. The list may seem rather long, but it actually isn't once I show you how to do it. First, you need to choose a source that contains the same concepts that you're working on in your own piece. Next, you want to select and introduce a quote that exemplifies an aspect of the writer's idea, the one that's the most relevant to your own, some kind of common or shared aspect. You want to explain the quote's meaning and significance in relation to the author's overall idea. You then want to, in writing, connect the source, connect the other writer to your own idea through that shared aspect. Then we want to see you think and reflect on the page about how this writer's idea adds, extends, or questions your own thinking about the particular concept. And you're going to think and reflect at the point of your piece of writing where your thinking has gotten to. And you'll see what I mean about that in a few moments. By following these steps, you will be creating movement in your own thinking instead of merely repeating what you've already said. It's much more interesting to read. Here is an example from Samara Hennet's work, Incidental Trees, that shows you some of these steps in her writing. So to begin, you can follow along in the text, by the way. You just need to find this part. To begin with, Hennet introduces the title of the text she's using, the author of that text, and then in a few words outlines Kingsolver's idea. You can see this in the colored section with the red background. In her essay, Stone Soup, Barbara Kingsolver writes about expectations for the future that could never quite be fulfilled. It is important that you think about your reader when you introduce a quote or another author's idea. We need to know where this information is coming from. So you do need to name the author for us. The first time you use that author's name in your own work, use their full name. After that, use their second name. You also need to name the work. And as you can see, Hennet has named Stone Soup. It's the title of an essay, and so it goes in quotation marks. If you were naming a book, you would put the title in italics. Now, this introductory set of words is quite important. You don't just drop a quote in without introducing it as part of your own sentence. So, on to the quote, which is, of course, the part that says, "I set upon young womanhood, believing in most of the doctrines of my generation." The reason this particular quote is indented on both sides instead of in quotation marks is because it's more than 4 lines long. You will see later in this piece how Hennet puts quotation marks around every word that she uses of Kingsolver's. But when the quote is this long, we can tell it's a quote because it's indented on both sides. Now, Hennet did a lot of work to choose this particular quote because it's got to focus on an aspect that she wants to talk about in her own piece, and it's got to exemplify Kingsolver's idea without pulling something out of context. So this quote, as you can see, Hennet doesn't just drop in and leave. Pardon me. I cannot tell you how many times I have seen a student drop in a quote at the end of a paragraph and leave us to figure out why it's there. So you want to avoid that. You put in the quote that you feel works at this particular point of the piece, and you then explain that quote in the context of the writer's idea in your own words. So the quote itself speaks, according to Hennet, Kingsolver's troubled marriage and decision to divorce drew her out of the charmed circle of the American family and rendered her culturally unworthy and invisible. Selfish, too, for not sticking it out or making it work. But she did not rebel against some wholly unalterable law. She simply became disillusioned with the image of the family in our culture, an exclusive model she chose to be outside. So we understand Kingsolver's idea, and we understand why this quote is here. Hennet does not simply leave Kingsolver at this point, however, because she wants to connect Kingsolver with Hennet's idea. And she does so in the next paragraph. Here, what she's going to do is narrow down from that broad idea of troubled marriage, decision to divorce, and the image of family in our culture. She's now going to narrow down to language, that particular concept, because that's what Hennet wants to discuss. And you can see her do it. Hennet uses her divorce as a means to talk about the family. So we see talk, language is being introduced, family is being retained, linguistic concept reinforces language. When she mentions her daughter, Kingsolver talks about how happy she is having 2 homes, 3 sets of grandparents, all the love that goes along with a large family. The main problem, she says, is that other people think we have a problem and assume the worst. Her daughter always has to explain the positives, others never infer them. Something else I want to point out, there is another quotation by Kingsolver in this paragraph. The main problem is that other people think we have a problem. Those are Kingsolver's words, and it shows it by putting quotation marks in them and by putting the page number in at the end of her sentence. Next, she's going to connect Kingsolver to Hennet's own thinking, and she does so in this really important sentence. What she realizes is that families outside the normal conception, like mine, require ever more language to explain. So we can see that connection being made, and it is based on families outside the normal conception and language. We would expect to see 2 concepts being discussed in Hennet at this point, and we will not be disappointed in the following paragraphs. We now move to Hennet's thought and reflection about that particular concept in the remainder of the paragraph. In the next paragraphs, Hennet focuses even more on family and language. We can see this. These paragraphs follow immediately upon the ones that you just read. Within a family, it's easy to live and thrive without definition. That's Hennet. But it's harder somehow to shrug off the family of dolls family values crew when they judge from their safe distance that divorced people, blended families, gay families, and single parents are failures. Kingsolver writes, yet another quotation about language, about families. After her divorce, she finds that the family connections are still intact. There is still mother, daughter, father love. Here is Hennet, here is thought, reflection. They have just moved beyond the terms traditionally reserved for these relationships. Look at the word terms. Hennet is still speaking about language. The word relationships indicates family. Hennet is now going to narrow down even further to the terms by which marriages and children are called. Kingsolver reminds us that a marriage that ends is not called finished, it's called failed, and that the children of this family may have been born to a happy union, but now they are called the children of divorce. Now, here is another important point. Not only do we see Hennet thinking and reflecting on the page about language, relationships, etc., but we also see her once again making the connection between Kingsolver and herself. And we see movement when she makes the connection this time. The language we use for our relationships affects how we view ourselves, as well as how others assess our worth. Kingsolver's idea focused on how others label and consider the people in a broken marriage. That is, by that term, broken or failed, and how other people see the children of that marriage. Hennet pushes this idea further in her thought and reflection by bringing in something new. She's applying Kingsolver's idea to her own situation and telling us the language we use for our own relationships affects us. That language affects us and how we view ourselves. Kingsolver doesn't say that. So she's pulling out of Kingsolver, but she's creating movement by using Kingsolver and applying Kingsolver to her own situations. We see the connection again. While I'm not divorced, I know what it feels like to have a set of human connections that falls outside a cultural pattern. Long-standing categories of identity are bridged and ruptured. We see that if you have read Hennet's full piece, you know why she is saying this, you know where it comes from. She's analyzing her own experience and her own scene and thinking and reflecting about it in relation to Kingsolver's ideas. She continues this paragraph with more thought and reflection. My tongue is forced to express subtle nuances. My sister is young. I am looking for the words. My brain is filled with jumbled images that I try to fit together into some coherent phrase. So in summary again, to use someone else's idea in your own work, the first thing you have to do is find a common shared connection and make that connection on the page. And then thought, reflection, thought, reflection, thought, reflection. What do you think about that writer's idea in relation to your thoughts at that point in your writing? How can you use that writer's idea to extend your thinking or add to it or question it, as Hennet has done? If you're having trouble doing this, there's a relatively easy solution. The first thing I would say is turn everything off while you do this work. Turn off your phone, turn off your text, turn off all notifications. You need to concentrate, just as Newman told us. Start a new page or a new screen. Type the quote that you've chosen from your author at the top, and then write until you've filled up the entire page without stopping. What do you make of what the author says? Your next step will be to reread that very rough writing and look for a nugget or two of worthwhile thinking in it, and then pull out those thoughts and expand on them. Try it. It helps a great deal. The next question is choice. How do you know what to choose? How do you know what source to choose? Once you've found the source, how do you know what aspect to choose? And how do you find a quote? By doing the same thing we've done before. I'm about to turn my camera off after this screen so that it won't interfere with what's showing on the screen. At this point, you would be well advised to pause this video, go back to the very first paragraph of Hennet's text, Incidental Trees, and take out your highlighter, do the exact same work that we did with Girl with a Pearl Earring. And that's look for different patterns. What do you notice in this piece, and how many patterns can you find? As you can see, I pretty well filled this text with color. I'll show you the patterns that I found in a minute. Always keep in mind, your patterns may differ because each of us sees texts a bit differently. Very quickly, I'm going to go through a few of the patterns that I found. I would emphasize again, you may have found different ones, and these are not all of the patterns. These are just really the most important ones that I picked up on. Pattern 1 is language, and I show that in yellow because what I found in that one paragraph is language interpretations, communicate words, means of expression, and convey. I named this pattern language. It seems to fit. I'm not really quite sure what to call this pattern yet. What I noticed was a series of words: consciousness, personal, self-expression, experiences, inner workings. I'm not quite sure whether this is personal identity or consciousness or perhaps even experience, but I have to name it something. So it's going to be one of those three, and I'm not going to be quite sure yet till I get further into Hennet's essay. I also found a third pattern. I'm not quite sure what to call it yet, because what you name a pattern becomes a concept that you look for Hennet to discuss. And it's also very helpful for finding out yourself what in actuality you're writing about. This pattern I saw was imperfect, incomplete, tangled, frayed, fail, all words with some kind of negative connotation. So my choices are failure or possibly incompleteness. We'll see what happens. My fourth pattern I'm calling fluidity because it's based on a series of words such as different, unique, flexible, diverge, and vary. What we have on the screen now is the first three paragraphs of Hennet's scene. You may be asking, why did I name those four patterns I found? And the answer is straightforward. If you recall, we begin by noticing, and we then look for patterns in what we've noticed. If we name those patterns so that they encompass everything we find, all the evidence we found for that pattern, we move to the level of concept. If we explore the relationship among those concepts in the author's writing, we will probably uncover a great deal about the author's idea. So we move from noticing to patterns to concepts, and we can then look for concepts and their relationships in the author's work. What you're seeing here now is the four different colors of the patterns that I found. If you try this exercise on your own with the patterns that you found, you will probably find different colors here. So the yellow one is language, and I find that this pattern holds true in the scene. What I found in the introduction is here. I have words, tell her, speak, convey, tell, trying to explain, writing, and character shift. I also have that pattern of seemingly imperfection or failure, It's still here in green. Complex, hard for me to grasp at first. Harder, burden, can't, frustrations, self-hate, revelation, and struggling. So that pattern holds true. I'm also finding what seems to be identity or experience. These ones are in purple. Identity, personal, self. Confirm and resist her own identity, her own future, and character shift. And I notice the purple and the yellow, the identity and language overlap. There is one last pattern here. That was fluidity. I'm finding it holds true here too. I have transitioning, female to a male, in relation to identity, new name and pronouns, new and raw. Transition of emotions. I'm afraid she'll be scared of him, this person she has always teased and adored. And we find unsure later on. But I found another pattern in here that I had not found in the introduction. I put it in bold. My sister and I, Sonia, my sister, the person I've been dating for 2 years, her, his. She loves him almost as much as she loves me. We, relationship, Sonia, we, converging apart. There's a new pattern here, and it encompasses more than just Hennet's sister Sonia. It also encompasses the person I've been dating for 2 years. This is something to do with family relationships. And here we are, a new pattern to add to the other ones. Sonia the sister, the partner loved by both of them, relationships. A possible name for this might be family. And that completes the patterns I have to work with for now. When you name your patterns, you really are looking for conceptual words. And when you're examining the text, that's one of the things that you're looking for. The concepts the writer considers are important. And you're also considering the relationship to each other of those concepts. So I found in Hennet, language, identity, failure or incompleteness, fluidity and family relationships. What did you find? You should have found at least a couple of these. You may have named them differently, and that's fine. You may also have found different ones, and that's fine too, as long as you can back them up with evidence from the text. I also include other essays in the readings, ones that contain complex ideas on different topics. This week is Alice Walker. And some of the concepts that you'll find she explores are beauty, appearance, perception. There are many, many conceptual words we have to choose from. And why am I emphasizing finding patterns and naming them? It's because when it comes to choosing another writer to connect to your own work, conceptual words is one of the ways to do it. The concepts and the patterns you find in that other person's work and the concepts and patterns you find in your own. Here is Hennet. You can see for yourself the pattern. This is going back to the Kingsolver quote, or one of them. You can see that I bolded all the words that have to do with family in here. That is a very strong concept in Kingsolver. It also happens to be a very strong concept in Hennet. They have those two in common. That's part of the reason Hennet chose Kingsolver. The second reason is because Kingsolver talks about language. That when she speaks of marriage, she did mention that marriages that dissolve are called failed, and children of divorce was another label that was used. So there are two concepts here that the two have in common. One is language, the other is family. You will see when you go back to the highlighting that Hennet has focused in not only on a writer, but on quotations where those two concepts are side by side. That's how she makes her connection. So you see that Kingsolver, finished, failed, children of divorce. Those are linguistic labels. Family goes all the way through that sentence. Marriage, children, union, children. Hennet does the exact same thing. So that's why searching for patterns, naming concepts, and then examining another writer, choosing the writer based on the concepts that you share, it's incredibly important because you can then write it into your text. I want to show you one last example from Hennet's work. And in this particular instance, I wanted to emphasize how far she's moved her thinking since she first introduced Kingsolver. She introduced Kingsolver near the beginning of her essay in the first third. This is one of her closing paragraphs, not the very ending, but close to it. This is her closing piece of thought reflection. Speech, says Hennet, is an impressionistic painting. Smears of light and color are thrown together in a way that conveys an idea or experience, even though the thing itself is impossible to fully capture. But realism is not the aim. Our words, like paintings, will always be artificial if we are seeking only to mirror reality. We must realize that details are not everything. Rees says that no matter to what degree you carry the detail, it should always be secondary to the pattern. The pattern, in my case, is the emotion that my words carry. The words themselves do not matter in the long run. They are the slim but sole means I have to convey something inexpressible. I cannot give my sister a complete picture of my experience, nor can I give one to the world. But I can give her patches of feeling. I can give her enough dots that when she stands back, she can see the image of our love and grief and longing. Samara Hennet, and what a brilliant, beautiful ending. So in summary, look for the concepts you're working with in your own writing. Find a connection, a shared concept with another writer who's working on the same concepts. Thoughtfully select a quote that epitomizes an aspect of their thinking, and then in your own words, introduce that quote in an appropriate place, including the writer's name and the title of the work. Include the quote. Check MLA on Google for whether to use quotation marks or indents to show it's a quote. Explain the meaning of the quote in relation to the author's more complete idea, and do it in your own words. And then make a connection between the writer's idea, that particular aspect you just showed us, and your own thinking, your own work. And then think and reflect. Add to or extend or question your thinking through that other author's idea to create movement. Well, what's next? I would ask that before you watch the brief presentation of Bourdieu's theory in part 3, which also includes Eden Lunsford, you watch Maya Angelou speak her powerful poem. I placed a link to it on eClass. Once you finish watching part 3, consider Angelou's idea in relation to Bourdieu's idea. What do you make of Bourdieu in relation to Angelou? How does she contradict, add, or extend his thinking? This ends part 2 of lecture 3. There is only one more short part to go. In the meantime, thanks for listening, and I will see you shortly. Bye for now.